I'd like to welcome everybody to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll. This is our, what has been in the past, comparative religion, adult religious education offering. Today, and the last few classes, we've taken kind of a divergence into religious studies, which is the broader umbrella under which comparative religion lives. And we're going to do that again today, and then next month I'm not sure, but we may dive into Buddhism as our next kind of topic. So let's review. In September 2016, there was a class that was an introduction to comparative religion, and that was where we talked about the similarities that we see among religious traditions. And then we had another lecture in 2017 called Differences and Divisions. And although this isn't the order we did all this in, this is a really good kind of order for introducing comparative religion. So we had a one on similarities, one on differences, and then it was 2 months ago because I was sick last month. 2 months ago, we had the first half of this religious studies class where we talked about the difference between theology and religious studies. So theology is where we start, where people are talking about their religion in terms of their own religious beliefs. And then they move to apologetics, where they're arguing with a different religious belief or a different religious group and trying to say, no, this is why our beliefs are true. Hermeneutics is a move away from that into an attempt at understanding. So hermeneutical interpretation of a text is where you take the text and you say, this is a religious text, say the Bible, and I'm not interested in whether it's true. I'm not interested in whether my religion is right and yours is wrong. I'm not trying to speak in theological terms to my congregation to help, convert their souls. Instead, I'm trying to understand the text. What did the author of this text mean when he wrote it? And then how has it been interpreted through time in the religious tradition? And that's the hermeneutical study. Religious studies, however, came about because of, among other things, the wars of religion. It was a great deal of conflict, especially with the Protestant Reformation. And it became obvious that people were going to have to find a way to kind of get along with each other despite the differences. And so people began writing in a more broad sense. Instead of speaking to their religion, they were talking about, well, how could we figure out what religion is true? How can we study the principle of religion in general? And it slowly morphs from theology through apologetics and down into this idea, well, let's study religion as a phenomenon like any other phenomenon that you might study scientifically. So we're going to scientifically study religion and try to figure out why it is people believe what they believe, why do they do what they do, and before you can even do that, what is it that people do? Because people had a very, this happened in the West, people had a very Christian-centric idea of what religion was. So they had to go out and find primitive tribes and study them, figure out what they believe. They had to go to the East and study Buddhism and Hinduism and try to see what all these different groups believe. And therein lies the origin of comparative religion as a subfield of religious studies, trying to figure out what it is that people do. And then once you figure out what it is they do, you can try to make a theory about what it is, where it came from, what it means in people's lives, why people do it. So you got to figure out the what before the why. The last class, we kind of focused on defining religion. So we said one of the biggest hurdles in studying religion is figuring out what is religion itself. How do you define it? What does it mean? And how does it compare to something that's non-religious? So we would say a football game is non-religious, but we would imply that going to church in a Christian cathedral is religious. So what is the difference and what is the distinction? And so we talked about a group of individuals who had each proposed different definitions. For example, David Hume says it's bad science. Karl Marx says it's the opiate of the masses and an economic system designed in the superstructure of economic theory in order to repress people. William James says it's a psychological phenomenon, and so he studies how people feel when they're religious in their mind. We have Sigmund Freud, who says it's like a neurosis, and is this form of wish fulfillment. And Richard Dawkins says it's a mimetic form of evolution, so a thought evolution. It's a virus. He says it's a virus that has taken over our minds and then evolves through time through this process of mimetic evolution, which is like genetic evolution, but for ideas. We have Jonathan Haidt. Ninian Smart gave the definition that I use, which is there were 7 dimensions, and we said a religion is something that scores highly on many of, but not all of these dimensions. And so that was kind of what we did last time. Today I want to I'm trying to get a lecture that explains my thoughts about how you get from, kind of this general concept of defining religion into comparative religion. So it's kind of a bridge between religious studies and comparative religion, which is what we've been doing. And I was trying to figure out how to do that and which thinkers, whose ideas to discuss. And there's a lot I could do, because we could talk about sociology or anthropology, because they spend a lot of time doing comparative religion because they're trying to figure out the what. They go into a specific place and they study how the religious beliefs impact the society, or they study how this particular tribe behaves and what religious rituals they perform, etc. And so they'll embed themselves within a tribe and study that, especially in the anthropologists. So that is one approach, bridge to comparative religion. But the other is the psychological approach. And there is, down both the psychological venue and the anthropological venue, there's a path to comparative religion that moves. And this is the one that is perhaps the most interesting to me for whatever reason. And so I thought I would start here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about William James briefly, not in any detail, but just as the background. And then I want to talk about Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Mircea Eliade. Now, I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist or any of those things, and so there are people who are going to know a lot more about Freud and Jung than me, but I want to talk about, if I can, just the parts of those thinking that influenced religion and the study of religion, and how that influenced our society even today. As we follow this thread, we can see in popular writing today the echoes of these people's thoughts and ideas in how we approach religion. So, if we start with William James, I'm sorry. So let's I got to get the right button. Let's start with William James. William James, if you remember, we talked about his definition of religion last time. He said the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. It's a lot of extra words to just say how people feel. He thinks about it as an individual thing. It's what's going on in an individual's mind. It's not a group thing. It's not a collective thing, as opposed to what the sociologists like Durkheim would have said about religion as a social phenomenon. So for him, religion is what happens in your head, and that's not necessarily relevant to what's happening outside, right? It doesn't matter if God exists. Religion is what's happening in your head when you think about whatever you consider divine, God, etc. And that let him kind of sidestep the question of whether God exists, and he moved on to the question of whether belief in God is useful, because it has impacts in our mind, whether we believe in it or not. And he called that whole philosophical chain pragmatism, which is it doesn't matter what's true, it matters what's useful, and the two coincide often, right? Because belief in gravity is useful because it allows me to chart a course to send an astronaut to the moon, if I understand gravity. So in that sense, the truth is also useful. But there are some cases where we can't tell what's true, and in that case he suggests we could default to what's useful. Like, I don't know if there's a God, but belief in God this is how he would have put it, belief in God makes me more moral and makes society more moral, because if you don't believe in God, we all go off and become heathens, obviously. And so if you believe in God, you'll be more moral, therefore that belief in God is useful, therefore since we can't prove whether he exists or not, we should believe in God because it's useful. This is very similar to Pascal's wager, except it's almost an evolution of Pascal's wager. And this was his justification for belief in God. But after he got that far, he said, well, if religion is this experience in the mind, and we're not so interested in what's happening out there, just in here, in the head. And he's a philosopher and a psychologist, or he's at least interested in the study of psychology. So then he went out and he started surveying the religious beliefs of a large number of people, trying to figure out, well, what is it that goes on in our head? Now, this, again, differs from theology because he's not writing what goes on in Christians' head. He's trying to find general principles that go on in everyone's head when they interact with the divine, with religion. So, the result of that study is the varieties of religious experience, and if this is my wife's collected copy of the writings of William James, which includes one of the first essays is his book on the varieties of religious experience, and he divides how people interact with religion into various categories. For example, we have the healthy-minded religious person. This is the optimist. This is the person who is just happy all the time, and their experience of God might be that they feel a sense of wonder, awe, and happiness, and joy, peace, love, and when they experience the divine, that's what they experience. You also might have the sick soul. This is someone who feels like something is desperately broken in the world, and so they want to find a way to fix it. So they might talk about original sin, and they might feel lowly and horrible, and they might seek for God to redeem them from how broken they are and the world itself is. And then you have the divided self. This is the person who feels kind of disconnected from himself in parts of himself, not to the multiple personality disorder sort of extent, but we are all divided. We all have desires that are at war. Right? It just reminds you of Paul, who says things like, that which I would not do, I do, but the spirit warreth against the flesh. This is the person who feels divided in his own self, and he seeks wholeness. He might seek meditation, find a way to connect himself to the wider universe and to himself, and to find that wholeness. And he goes on. There's a long, long list. So what we have in William James is this attempt to categorize how people feel when they experience God. This is not yet comparative religion, but he's getting there because to figure out how people feel, he has to go out and talk to people of different religious beliefs. And he's starting to compare and contrast them. Mostly he's categorizing them, right? But he's starting to compare and contrast. So you'll remember the earlier people, especially before William James, often categorized religion as bad science. And what William James is saying, no, religion is inner experience. And there is bad science in religion. He admits that, right? He says some religious people believe things that we know are not true. But that's not what religion is. Religion is this inner experience that people have that can be then tied to, good science or bad science. But that's, he would argue, is beside the point. So it's a move from bad science to inner experience. And by so doing, he also moves the study of religion from a catalog of human error to a study of human nature. And so the reason I wanted to take a small digression into William James is that this is why I study comparative religion. My interest in comparative religion is that I believe it is the greatest window we have into the varieties of human nature. He calls it the variety of religious experience, right? But I'm talking about the varieties of what it means to be human. And so by moving to the inner experience of the religious person, if I'm going to study comparative religion, and I believe that religion is just bad science, all I'm doing is cataloging all the dumb things people believe. And what's the use of that? But religion is more than that. It's why do they believe things? What do they hope for? What do they think is wrong with the world? What do they think might solve it? What do they wish for in their deepest heart, right? And so for me, it's a study of what it means to be human. And so William James is the first step into why I do this, right? Because it's this movement into a study of the varieties of human nature. In fact, if we look at the subtext, right, he says the varieties of religious experience, a study in human nature. Right? So this is why I do what I do and why I teach the classes I teach. So next we have Sigmund Freud. chronologically, sort of speaking. Sigmund Freud says religion is like a group neurosis. Remember, that is his definition of religion that we talked about last time. Let's talk about where that comes from and what he even means by wish fulfillment and group neurosis. And so we need to do that. I need to take this whole divergence into psychoanalysis and tell me about your mother, and we're going to talk about all that, not because I really know what I'm talking about there, but because I think it sets the background for what he says about religion. So I've got to wade into something I don't really know a lot about, which is psychoanalysis and psychiatry and all that sort of thing. So what is psychoanalysis is the variant of therapy that Freud kind of initiated in his school. Among the various sort of things you can do, like cognitive behavior therapy, well, psychoanalysis is the Freudian kind of approach. And it's based on this idea, which, as I understand it, is not unique to Freud, but is first produced by Freud, or described by Freud, of the unconscious. And he used the analogy of an iceberg. A very small tip of the iceberg is above water, that's the conscious, but there's this vast unconscious underneath, which are the contents of the mind that we are not aware of. Which sounds almost contradictory, because if we're not aware of it, how is it the mind, right? But this is actually a very insightful thing, because there are parts of our own brain's function that we are not aware of. So this is what we know about the subconscious. There's a lot we know about it, but this is kind of, if I just take a brief moment back from what Freud thought and talk about what it really might be. For example, we know that there are aspects of the brain whose purpose is to find edges. Right? So it's the visual cortex, and it has an entire layer of neurons. Its entire purpose is to find edges in what your eye sees. And it sorts out all the different colors and individual little firing of neurons and sorts them into edges. And says there's an edge there, there's an edge there. And that's why things look like separate things when we look out. We don't realize this is happening because it's happening at a subconscious level. We also know from split brain people that they confabulate, and meaning they make stuff up, and their conscious mind tells you why they think they're doing things, and it's not why they're actually doing things. For example, you can show a split-brained patient a picture of a snow scene to one side of the brain and a picture of a chicken to the other side of the foot to the other side of the brain. You can ask them to pick up cards, one with each hand, and each hand is controlled by a different side of the brain. And these are split brains, so the two halves don't talk to each other. And one hand will pick up the chicken because he saw a chicken foot, and the other hand will pick up a shovel. And then you can ask the person why they did what they did. Now remember, the left side of the brain, which is controlling the right hand, is the one that can speak. And it will happily say, why did you pick up the chicken? Well, because of the chicken foot. Well, why did you pick up the shovel? Well, to shovel the chicken shit out of the chicken shed. And then they'll ask, do you remember thinking that's why you picked it up? And did you pick it up for that reason before you picked? Yeah, I did. Well, no, that's not why you picked it up. You picked up the shovel to shovel the snow. But he doesn't know that, or the conscious part of the individual's brain doesn't know that. And so the fact of the matter is, our consciousness tells us why we think we do things. It does not actually determine why we do things. We do things for subconscious reasons, and then our consciousness makes up stuff to explain why we just did all this, right? So that's what we kind of think of the unconscious today. It's a very common thought, and we realize that most of our brain processing happens at an unconscious level, and we actually think there's one little part of our brain that kind of watches the other stuff that's going on, and that kind of critic that self evaluates the rest of the brain is the conscious bit, but most of it is all unconscious. Well, what Freud thought it was this kind of place where when you are faced with something you just don't want to face up to, you avoid it. And your conscious can suppress things until eventually your subconscious represses it, and it moves from your conscious mind down into the unconscious, which is this damp, dark, dirty basement sewer where all of your evil thoughts kind of live and fester until they drive you crazy. And that is actually why people go crazy, because they've repressed things down into this basement of their unconscious. Which I think if you the joke about Freud is, that everything has to do with sex with your mother. But if you believe that all of our problems come from repressed desires, then you kind of see where that stereotype comes from. So let me give you an example. This one is from M. Scott Peck. And he's a practitioner of psychotherapy, but it's not from Freud, but it kind of illustrates how you use psychotherapy to help somebody by asking them about their mother. So here's an example from Peck. Peck says he had a patient who came in and said, I'm deathly afraid of spiders. If there's a spider in the room, I can't enter the room. I have to have other people go into the room before me and kind of sweep it of spiders, make sure it has no spider, or I can't go in because I'm so deathly, deathly terrified of spiders. And it was getting to the point where it was, negatively impacting her life. And so Peck started asking her about her mother. Tell me about your mother, right? Tell me about your family. Tell me about your early life. Tell me about, and started asking her questions about her life. And it turns out that her father was kind of absent and wasn't really involved, but her mother was having an affair, cheating on her father, and would, even after she left home, would come to her daughter's house to tell her all about her affair, and how great it was, and then would ask her probing and deep questions about her own sex life, and was just, and the mother would not leave her alone, had no sense of boundaries, etc. But if you ask her, do you love? I love my mother. Okay, so eventually he just kind of kept talking to her about this situation, and eventually this woman blurted out, "My mother is just like a spider." And she said, "Aha!" And of course, Peck says, I saw that from the beginning, but I couldn't say it. She had to figure it out. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to lead the patient to make that insight themselves and to say, the reason I'm afraid of spiders is because I am really angry at my mother, but I'm not allowed to be angry at my mother because society and the country radio songs on the radio tell me that my mother is the greatest thing that ever happened. So I'm not allowed to be angry at my mother, but I am angry at my mother. And so I've repressed that down into the subconscious, and it's broken out in a misapplied way. Instead, it's taken the anger and from my mother and transferred it to spiders. And now I'm afraid of spiders because I'm afraid of my mother. And once you realize what's really happened, you can say, oh, I know what's really happening. You move it from the unconscious into the conscious. Now you can deal with it like an adult, and you can overcome your problem. And this is the good psychoanalytic result. And now you're not afraid of spiders anymore because you realize you're just mad at your mother. Okay, so this is what Carl Jung said about that. And again, we'll talk about Jung in a minute, but it's a good summary of what Freud said on this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And so the goal of his psychiatrist approach was to try to help people become aware of their subconscious beliefs. Now, I'm not making a comment about whether this is actually what happens in people's brain or whether this is actually a good way to help people. Most therapists and psychiatrists today don't follow this approach anymore, but this is how Freud approached the problem. And I think part of the problem is, if you've ever seen something like The Boy Erased, you remember they thought he was the origin. This is a movie about that's based on a book about a reparative therapy where they were trying to cure a gay individual, and they told him that he was gay because he hated his father. And he kept saying, I don't hate my father. but you must hate your father somewhere buried deep down inside. You hate him. No, I don't, right? And so this is I guess, the problem. But we shouldn't spend too much time critiquing this approach because this is not my field. I want to talk about how it relates to religion. So here's what you do. To get the unconscious out, you have to figure out some way to talk to the unconscious. So you have things like free association, where you just ask the patient to talk and talk and talk and say whatever comes to their mind. This is where we get the phrase Freudian slip, because there is this belief that if you say something and you say the wrong thing, it's because maybe there was a subconscious thought pushing to actually say a different thing. Actually, we know that happens, in fact. You can catch yourself doing it once in a while because how we choose what to kind of say is almost like how bees decide whether to swarm. The neurons will fire one way, saying, say this, and the other neurons will fire the other way, say this other thing. And when one of them crosses a threshold, then we choose to say that. And sometimes when they fight and they're right at the balancing point, sometimes we'll say half of each, and it makes no sense, and we'll catch ourselves doing that. But his idea was that this is actually a window into the subconscious. He also has these inkblot tests were not developed by Freud, but later psychoanalysts would make the same idea. What you do is you create something that is a random pattern, and you ask people what they think they see. And when you do that, what they think they see, the argument goes, is a window into the subconscious. Freud thought that dreams were very important and were also a window into the subconscious. And here's where we start to move into comparative religion, because dreams and he wrote a book about interpreting dreams in 1899. Dreams and myths are closely related, and Jung used to call the dreams and the myth land kind of the mythical part of the brain. And so what comes out in our dreams and what comes out in our stories and our myths are actually both windows into the same subconscious. And so you can use that to interpret and understand religion. Now, Freud had this story that he told that he thought was the origin of religion. He said religion originated when a bunch of early humans lived in a society where one man was an alpha male. He controlled access to all the females. So all the females were mothers of the people in the tribe, and there was one man who dominated them and had all sexual access to them. And then the other males became frustrated with this situation, and so they murdered him. But then they had to marry these women who were basically their mothers, and so this created the Oedipus complex of this whole desire to have sex with your mother. And they created within themselves a sense of utter horror at incest because they felt so bad about what they'd done, and they couldn't admit that their father was dead, so they projected him up into the sky and created an imaginary sky father. Now that story of the origin of religion is based on no evidence. It is retrodicted backwards in time based on what he thought he saw in the mythology of today, namely the Oedipus complex. He saw that in his patients. He thought he saw that in his patients anyway. He thought he saw it in all these myths and things. And so he said, well, there must be some origin of this complex, and he projected it back in time. And so this was his theory of the origin of religion. And so for him, it was nothing but something to avoid. It was a neurosis, where neurosis is the exact identical thing as the woman's fear of spiders. It's misplaced and misapplied thoughts about one thing that's been applied to the other, but for him it's a group neurosis based on an event in our primordial past. And now, if you think about his approach of psychoanalysis, the right therapeutic outcome is to realize that the reason you believe in religion is wish fulfillment, not because it's real, and because you have this guilt over the things you want to do that society won't let you do. And if you realize that you've misapplied all that stuff into this false religious belief, you can overcome it. You can stop believing in nonsense. This is, again, how Freud would have viewed religion. You can stop believing in all this nonsense, and you can just start approaching your own repression as an adult who sees it for what it is, and you take it out of the unconscious, and then you solve the religious problem. So for him, religion is a problem to solve. Which brings us to Jung. Carl Gustav Jung was a psychiatrist who had... I'll show you his autobiography in a bit. I listened to the autobiography. I'd never done it before, listened to it before, but in preparation for this class over the last couple of months, I listened to the whole thing. It's fascinating. So you should listen to his autobiography. It's really fun stuff. But as a child, he felt socially awkward, out of place. I found it difficult to make friends. He was interested in things that were very different than all of his contemporary and his friends were. His father was a theologian, but when he talked to his father about religion, he felt like his father's belief was empty. It was about ideas. And for Jung, religion was about his own experience of God, because he had experienced God in his life. He had dreams that he found to be both prophetic sometimes, but also just profoundly moving. He had what he considered visions. He described within his own personality what it's not split personality, because he realized both of them were himself, and he kind of could move back and forth. But he saw within himself what he did personify as two different individuals. He had personality 1, he called him, and personality 2. 1 was the little boy, and 2 was this old, wise man who knew, all sorts of things that the boy himself didn't know, and lived in the past, etc. And so he had this sense that he knew that God was real. That wasn't a question for him because of his experience with God. And asking these theological questions about God was utterly irrelevant. That his father was interested in. And theology was utterly irrelevant. It was just about the experience. So for him, he'd had these experiences. His break, well, he was doing his own research and being fairly successful, but his real break came when he became friends of Freud's. He sent Freud one of his papers. Freud invited him to come out. He went out and met Freud, and they stayed up all night talking for 13 hours straight. They were so excited. And it was specifically, Jung had read Freud's interpretation of dreams. And because Jung had dreams that he thought were prophetic and manifestations of God, he really wanted to talk to Freud about this. And of course, they found that they didn't agree about a lot of this very quickly. They agreed about some of it, and they were almost, kindred souls. And Freud thought that Jung was going to be his successor. He treated him like a father and expected him to obey like a son. There's actually a letter from Freud to Jung at the end of the autobiography that is just a fascinating read, because he tells him things like, as your paternal father, I hope you don't mind if I give you some advice, and then proceeds to tell him what he must do. It's a fascinating read. And they split over, go ahead, check. Freud was older, but I don't know how much older. I've got the dates here. I can go back and look at them in a minute.
About 20 years, because Freud died before the outbreak of, just around the time of the outbreak of World War II, and Jung died about 20 years after.
So Jung was born in 1875, and Freud was born in William James, hold on. Yeah, 1856. So, let's see. They were friends. They worked together. They published papers together. They went to conferences together. They knew each other intimately. They talked a lot, and Freud considered him his son. And then Jung started to have. Jung believed in parapsychology. He was very interested in telekinesis. He actually studied UFOs. As a psychological phenomenon. He doesn't seem to believe that there were really aliens there. He just thought this was an interesting psychological phenomenon because it's a group delusion. He was very interested in that for that sort of reason. And I may be slaughtering some of Jung's beliefs about things like the UFOs that he studied, but he believed in precognition. He attended seances, and he started to incorporate that material into his research. And Freud said, you can't do this. It's academic suicide. You must stop. And Jung refused, and they split over this and several other differences. They also had a difference in terms of how they thought about the unconscious. They also differed about whether repressed sexual desire for your mother is really the source of all, and again, I'm being a little flippant here, but is really the source of all neurosis. Freud was convinced that sex was either the prime source or at least involved. Sexual repression was the source of almost, if not all, neuroses. In fact, there was a time when he said all, and then I believe later in life he backed off of that and said most, but he was very convinced that it was the source of all these problems, which has become a running joke for Freud. Carl Jung had noticed in some of his patients that they had problems that were unrelated to sex. In fact, although sex was involved in the story about the spider, if you think about it, it was the problem that the mother had no boundaries. It's not that the daughter wanted to have sex with the mother. It was that the mother had no boundaries that was causing this neurosis. It wasn't repressed sexual desire. It was repressed anger at the mother. And so Jung saw that sort of thing and said, no, it's not all about sex. Sex is one thing among many that can cause problems. He also didn't see the unconscious as this problem. He didn't think that everything that was pushed into the subconscious was pushed there because of repression. like Freud did. He believed that the subconscious contained within it things like our human nature, our instincts is the word he used. So our instincts live within the subconscious. And if we have instincts, then we have a subconscious and an unconscious. And so for him, the unconscious contained not just repressed things, but these other bits. He also had a very interesting idea, what he called the collective unconscious. Now, we saw some of this. Freud doesn't believe in this, but we saw some of it in his group neurosis. So Jung runs with that and says, we have a collective set of beliefs. Now, you can believe that collective set, and many of Jung's followers today believe that there's a psychic connection between us that creates this collective unconscious that we all share, like a paranormal connection between everybody. But Jung was very careful, I think, in his writing to kind of separate his own beliefs in the paranormal from kind of what he could show scientifically. And he said, well, no, this is just something that we all share because we're human. Now, remember why I study comparative religion. Do you remember from when I talked about William James? I study religion because I want to know what it means to be human. And so what Carl Jung says is that when we look at religious traditions around the world, there's so much similarity in each of these traditions that everyone's kind of doing the same thing. There must be some shared element of our unconscious, because he believed all these things bubbled out of our unconscious. All our myths, all our dreams were coming out of the unconscious. Therefore, the fact that they were the same everywhere means that there must be a collective set of contents in our unconscious that the similarities we see across religious traditions illuminate. So for him, studying a comparative religious study, in other words, and he compiled a voluminous comparative religious mythology, world mythology study. He wrote volumes collecting everything he could, comparing them and finding patterns. And he thought each of those patterns illustrated an element of our collective subconscious. In his autobiography, he goes a little bit further and he says our unconscious exists outside of time. That's why he thought you could have dreams that could foretell the future. And our conscious exists kind of within time. And he said the problem is our conscious knows how to speak. Our unconscious doesn't. Our unconscious understands the world. Our conscious doesn't understand, but our conscious is what can speak. And so he thought that by delving into the unconscious, you could get at these kind of more fundamental truths, because what he's really talking about there, among other things, is his experience with God. But he's trying to avoid that in his research. But when he talks about that, he's talking about his own experiences with dreams that he believed were foretellings, with his childhood experiences of God, etc. So we have this idea of the collective subconscious. If you're trying to study it scientifically, you can just say it's a collective elements of human nature. If you want to talk about it in the believer's sense, which many of his followers do, you can talk about it as this thing that lives outside of time, that is connected to all of the universe, and that kind of knows these grand truths that we don't know, that we need the subconscious to teach us. And he believed that the subconscious taught and spoke in images. Whereas our conscious speaks in words, our unconscious speaks in images. Images that bubble up in our dreams and in our myths. And so he called these the archetypes. These are the images that he believed were shared across all these religious traditions. There were images of the trickster, images of the mother, images of the evil mother. Right? So we have the mother, but we also have the evil mother. We have the wise sage. This was his personality too, among other things, right? Who teaches us the truth. We have the hero. We have the young woman who is the seductress, etc., and the also symbol of innocence. And he would see these themes in the different myths that each different tradition would share. And he cataloged them, and he ordered them, and he came up with names for them. For example, this is how he would approach the devil. Freud would approach the devil by saying there is no such thing, stop believing in fairy tales. And Jung said, it doesn't matter if there's a devil out there. In fact, maybe there isn't. But there is a devil image in religious traditions from around the world. Clearly, there is some element of our subconscious that is interested in the personification of that which is dark. the dark, that goes along with the light, that balances the light. It's the other half of reality. And if you just say the other half of reality doesn't exist, well, that's nonsense. Of course it exists. And so for him, it's a personification of darkness that lives in all of our unconscious, that bubbles out in these images of the dark devil that we need to study and understand, because if we don't understand ourselves. And we don't understand the dark part of ourselves and the temptation part of ourselves and the part that makes us do things that we don't want to do. Like Paul says, I'm at war with myself. That which I do not want to do, I do, and that which I want to do, I don't do. He says you've got to understand that image and the frustrations that creates in our own psyche. And those frustrations are illustrated in this archetype of the devil. And so for him, studying the devil teaches you about that archetype. You also have this image of the dual mother. This is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. It's the Virgin Child with St. Anne. St. Anne is Mary's mother in kind of apocryphal writings. And so this is Mary, Mary's mother, and the Virgin Child, Jesus. And obviously, I think Leonardo is looking at this and saying, well, this is Mary's mother, and this is Mary, and this is Jesus, and this is 3 generations. And remember, the Catholic Church had this belief in the Immaculate Conception of Mary, so she was also kind of a virgin birth. And so here you have these kind of generations of virgin births, and it was a religious theme in that sense. You go ahead, Chuck.
The Immaculate Conception of Mary is not about virgin birth. The problem kind of rises here. The Catholic Church very much emphasized original sin. Mary, the concept of Immaculate Conception is Mary is conceived and born without original sin, and therefore satisfies the requirement to be the mother of Jesus, who's going to be God.
That's correct.
Yeah. So don't say virgin birth in both cases.
Okay. So there was just a clarification of Immaculate Conception. What happens with this particular image, Freud wrote a paper about this where he said this is evidence that Leonardo da Vinci is gay. I have no idea whether he really was or not, but that was Freud's conclusion because it represents, he could see within it images of repressed sexuality and etc., whatever Freud's deal was. Jung looked at this picture and said, no, I see in all these other religious traditions. So you see how, by the way, you see how Freud is kind of dismissing the religious part of it. That's not interesting to him. For Jung, he looks at it and he says, I see in religious traditions from around the world the image of 2 mothers played over and over again. He sees it in this religion or this, and he has a whole catalog of religious images from around the world with 2 mothers in them. He says, why is it that this concept of 2 mothers bubbles up? I mean, in this case, one is the mother of Jesus, one is the mother of Mary, but the concept of 2 mothers displayed together like this is what he believes is an archetype because it shows up over and over and over again. And his question is, why does that archetype show up so much so that Leonardo da Vinci was motivated to paint it? And he says it's not actually for the reason, that the Christian, this is a picture of Mary and her mother, right? For him, that story was borrowed so that he could paint 2 mothers because there's a drive to talk about and see 2 mothers buried in our subconscious through the archetypes. And so he says, why? And he ties this to this idea of rebirth. You see, there are 2 parts of our nature, the light part and the dark part, thus the discussion of the devil that we just had. And so we have to have a natural birth, but we also can be born again. You see, when the Egyptian Pharaoh was crowned, he was born again, given a new name, and became a child of God. Baptism is a rebirth in Christian traditions. And in Indian traditions, we've talked about how the group of people in the certain castes are called the twice-born, and they have this cord because their initiation involves their rebirth, and the cord represents their birth into this second new birth of manhood. So there's this idea of rebirth, and he says if we have a natural birth and we have to be born again, we need a second mother to represent our rebirth. Now, you notice that is not how a Christian would have interpreted this picture. I'm almost positive this is not how Leonardo da Vinci would have interpreted this picture. But what Jung is doing is he's finding patterns across all religious traditions and then trying to ask the question, what do they really mean and why do they bubble up everywhere we see them? Now, without making too much of a judgment, I just want you to understand ideas, right? The purpose is to understand ideas. But without making too much of a judgment, I do want to say the problem with that is that just like the ink blots, the idea of the ink blot is that you look at it and what you see is a representation of your own unconscious. But the reason people see things in ink blots is because humans are pattern-finding creatures. We see patterns. Our brains are designed to illuminate patterns. And it's really easy to see patterns where no pattern actually exists. I've talked about this before, but in machine learning and statistics land, we call that overfit. When you overfit noise and you think you found a pattern in noise that isn't really there, it's just overfit. And so when you interpret something like this in a way that I believe the artist probably wouldn't have, you're probably overfitting. But again, if you're Jung, you believe that there's a subconscious. The artist doesn't know why he's doing it. It's an archetype of the artist's own subconscious. Just like the woman didn't realize that her fear of spiders came from her anger at her mother. Similarly, Leonardo doesn't understand why he's driven to paint this image, but it's an archetype of his own subconscious. Now, in Jung's defense, he had his own experiences with these things in his own subconscious, and he was delving not only the kind of patterns in the world's religions, but in his own psyche. He was trying to figure out what these dreams meant that he was having, and that interwove in and out of his own research. So those are the archetypes. They're these images that live in our subconscious, in our collective subconscious. That's why they're shared across religious traditions, and they bubble up in images because our subconscious speaks in images and our conscious speaks in words. So he was also very interested in alchemy, in Gnosticism. He believed that Gnostic Christianity, which we haven't covered, we ought to do that someday, it's interesting stuff. He believed that Gnostic Christianity preserved all sorts of these kind of occult traditions which were passed down through alchemy, which is, there was a lecture I've done, and I'll link it in the video description to this, on alchemy, and I actually recommend that. It was one of the funnest classes I taught, where the idea of alchemy isn't to just turn lead into gold, it's to transform ourselves and to turn the lead of ourselves into the gold. And Jung saw that as the process of psychoanalysis itself. And so he saw all these things that he was doing buried within the symbols of alchemy, but he saw those things projected in symbolism, in symbolic language instead of in the language of psychology. And so for him, this was this wonderful treasure trove of the archetypes buried in the arcane symbols of alchemy that really talk about how to transform your own soul, which is what he was trying to do with his psychoanalysis. He was also very fascinated with mandalas. Mandalas are usually interpreted as cosmograms of the universe and as representations of heaven and earth and the connection of heaven and earth and the sacred center at the center of the mandala. The mandala, you notice you can never draw a center because there's always a center of a center of a center. You point at the center using that which surrounds it, because the center is an infinitesimally small point. And so the mandala, which is this drawing here, is here. This is designed to point at the center point using the images that surround it, the circle and the square. And these T's are gates, like a temple. This whole thing is a temple with another circle inside, and then at the center is the center point of the circle, representing that divine center. Now, Jung saw it as a representation of the self. And so this was the divine center is the ultimate self, almost in an Upanishadic way, if we go back to the Hinduism stuff we were talking about. And so the idea was to get at that central self by looking at all the stuff that surrounds it, the ego, the dreams, the etc. So he was very interested in mandalas. And this is the autobiography I talked about, C.G. Jung, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Now, Jung published volumes and volumes of work. Like the the library of Jung's publications is vast, and summarizing what he believed and said and taught is very difficult, and he refused to do it himself, mostly because he said, if I say anything, then I'll say too much or I won't say enough. Because if I say a little bit, why would I say a little bit about something I worked so hard to cover thoroughly? Right? Why would I leave all that out? And it doesn't make any sense. So he kind of refused to perform this kind of popular summary of ideas that I just did. In fact, he probably would find my attempt to do that to his work kind of offensive. On the other hand, I believe that it's useful to know what's out there, and you don't have time to be an expert in everything, and none of us have time, I think, to read everything Carl Jung wrote if we're not going to be, if that's not our job or our thing that we are being an expert in. You can get a degree in the teachings of Jung if you want. I know people who have one. But it's useful, I think, to try to know what's out there and to summarize. It's just very difficult to do with him because he refused to do it himself. And so we have to kind of comb through his work and try to summarize it. And I found other people who tried to do that, and then I tried to follow their work, and then I read this book of his, and I probably have if someone is here who actually knows a lot about Jung, you probably believe that I slaughtered this, and I probably have. But I'm hoping that this gives kind of people an idea of what's there, and piques their interest maybe to read this biography, because it was really good. I think this autobiography at least is worth reading. So how does this relate to the broader picture? Well, I think this goes back to William James, right? We're moving it from a study of bad science into a study of human nature. And then Freud says it's a neurosis, which is part of human nature, but it's this group neurosis. And then Jung comes along and says, no, it's our collective subconscious. And I don't think I would phrase it that way, but I believe it is our collective human nature. And if I phrase it that way, I'm very much a Jungian. Now, whether I believe that our subconscious really can have dreams that have premonitions of the future, I think part of that is also overfit, right? You have lots of dreams that don't turn out to be true, and you forget those, and then you have one dream that seems to predict the future, and that sticks in your mind, and you're like, oh my gosh, our dreams predict the future. Right? So I think we have to be careful to decide that that's really happening. But whether you believe in that or not, this idea that we have within ourselves, if we're careful not to overfit the noise and the patterns, we have within ourselves a shared nature. And that shared nature bubbles out. And that's one of the reasons we see so many similarities across religious traditions. It's why studying those religious traditions is interesting. And it is expressed in symbols and archetypes. And we see those in the myths, in the dreams, in the stories we tell, etc. And so to that extent, I find Jung's teachings incredibly fascinating because they mirror mine in many ways, and in many ways they don't. But in many ways they mirror why I do this and why I'm interested in religion in general. So let's take a break, and we will come back and do the second half, and we'll talk about Eliade and be done. We've got maybe 20 minutes left.